I'm Heather Hendry, the Senior Paper Conservator at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. And I'm so pleased that everyone could join me today. To introduce DIPSNY a little bit before we begin. DIPSNY is a 5-year initiative to deliver training and services to New York's collecting institutions. DIPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and conservation surveys, guidance with strategic planning, and access to a variety of educational programs and in-person workshops. We've been doing more webinars right now while everyone's at home, and there's also dozens of archived webinars for all types of collection topics that are all available on the DIPSNY website and the YouTube channel. DIPSNY makes these services available free of charge to New York-based organizations that collect, preserve, and make accessible historical records and library research materials. So that's all of you. And I've got Marissa from DIPSNY is dropping information into the chat as we mention it. You can keep an eye on that. And I'll be trying to watch that if there's any questions that come up during the presentation. DIPSNY itself is a collaboration between 2 long-running New York programs, the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation Preservation Program. It was established in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education to provide services for all organizations that are safeguarding New York's records. My name is Heather Hendry, and I work for CCAHA, which is a regional conservation lab in Philadelphia where the DIPSNY program is based. CCAHA services include preservation, education, digital imaging, book, paper, and photo conservation, and housing and framing. We have staff dedicated just to DIPSNY, but we also serve clients across the country. So New York State clients are eligible for services both from DIPSNY and through CCAHA. Today, I plan to give a really broad understanding of light. If you were to look online, you can find museum recommendations for maximum light measurements during exhibition. But those standards are really broad bands that might not address your specific artifacts or how your institution works. Or you might not have a light meter available to check the lighting. So I'd like to help you to make decisions to reduce the light on your collection overall, but also to make sure that your collection can be accessed and viewed adequately. And if you have any questions, I'll try and keep an eye on it during the webinar, but also there'll be lots of time at the end as well. Let's start with a really strong basis of what is light. So visible light is a section of a larger group called electromagnetic radiation. And what makes it light is that our eyes can detect it. Electromagnetic radiation includes many other waves you might be familiar with, like X-rays, microwaves, or radio waves. These waves all have basic similarities. They are the same thing at the core, but they differ in that their wavelength is different. Even within the visible section, the different colors of light have different wavelengths. So the wavelength of light determines the color of the light and whether it is visible to our eyes. The colors of the rainbow that you see at the bottom are arranged in order of wavelength. And we see a rainbow because when white light is diffracted through a prism, different wavelengths will bend more or less. Now, within the visible spectrum are the different colors that our eyes can detect. Most light sources will have all of the colors, that is, all of the possible wavelengths of light. When the light hits an object, it will absorb most colors of light. So this green object is reflecting green light to our eyes, but most of the other colors are absorbed. And if we remember that visible light is part of a continuous spectrum, Then there are other invisible forms of radiation that might also be present. Ultraviolet, which you'll be familiar with, is just past the purple when we arrange all the colors by order of wavelength. We'll be discussing ultraviolet as well as visible light today, and I'll usually be saying UV. UV has a shorter wavelength and it will interact with solid objects, so it's causing both sunburns and art to fade. Now, the UV end of this part of the spectrum has the most potential to cause damage. The visible light still has energy and it will still damage things. There's not like a sharp cutoff between the UV and the purple or the blue light. We just make this distinction based on what our eyes can see. So if you think of, there's a steady continuum between visible light and UV light. It's not like 1 nanometer of difference is going to make visible light suddenly safe for your artworks and UV is dangerous. So UV is more damaging than visible light and blue light is more damaging than red light, but all forms of light can cause light-induced damage. We usually talk about filtering UV because this is more damaging. And it's an easy thing to do because we don't see UV, so it doesn't change the visual experience to filter out. But visible light will also cause damage over time. If you look at this graph, the orange peak is the light that our eyes can see. So you see that it sort of trails off at the left, which is where the UV zone is. And it also trails off at the right that we can't see the infrared zone. Green line, on the other hand, represents how much power there is in the light, the power to damage that the different wavelengths can have. So you see there's a lot of potential for damage present on the left where the UV is, but it's not actually visible until it overlaps with the orange line. As we get into light-induced damage, fading is the most drastic and well-known light damage that can happen. And what we usually see is that some colors are more sensitive than others. 20th century color photographs had a very sensitive magenta dye. So we might see the blues and yellows looking almost normal. And fading can be really hard to detect if you can't see an unfaded example to compare to. So we might glance at this picture and assume that the girls were wearing white or pale blue dresses until we see the covered edge where her dress was actually pink and the family was posed against a brown background. The open book cover in the bottom left was on a shelf for many years. So the front and back covers were protected from light while the spine was exposed. And I also want to introduce the idea of just noticeable fade or just noticeable change. This is obviously a subjective amount of change. I used to work at the Canadian Conservation Institute, which is staffed half with conservators and half with scientists. And they were trying to define how much change was acceptable. So they brought in a bunch of staff to look at examples and classify them as noticeable, acceptable, and unacceptable. What the conservators ranked as unacceptable, the scientists who were trained in different forms of perception were ranking those as unnoticeable. So who you ask is going to affect your answer of what is noticeable and what is acceptable. But I think it's useful just to have that conversation. As a very broad rule, it might take about 10 units of just noticeable change to make an artwork unexhibitable. And after about 30 units of just noticeable change, there'll be basically no information visible at all. Beyond fading, newsprint is an example of a material that's extremely susceptible to yellowing from light exposure, especially UV. And it will yellow very quickly, even before the sheet becomes weakened, but a loss of strength will follow soon after. And there's also some pigments you might find that will darken from light instead of fading, like red vermilion is an example of that. You can also see a result of darkening from just a loss of fluorescence. So fluorescent dyes that you might find in highlighters or in bright white papers can become exhausted. And when they're no longer contributing their glow, the overall appearance may actually look darker. If you look at the orange and the yellow Sharpie samples here, the left side was covered and the right side was exposed to light. So at this point, the orange ink has almost completely faded away, while the yellow lost its fluorescence, so it actually appears darker at this point, and that will also fade over time until it's undetectable. Oh, the loss of strength from light exposure is due to photooxidation. And photooxidation is a term for a certain type of light-induced chemical reaction. It occurs in plastics, paper, fabrics, wood, anything that's like an organic substance. It can be recognized by yellowing, but it also results in brittleness, weakening, loss of flexibility, and increased acidity. All of those things can lead to physical damage. Light is providing the energy to activate the chemical reactions, but they also rely on oxygen and moisture in the air. So you can see these factors combining to create deterioration. This yellowing is also commonly seen on the varnish layer of old oil paintings, which is one reason why old master paintings have sort of a golden glow. For black and white prints or drawings on paper, the media might be composed of a carbon pigment that's totally light fast, but the paper support will still be weakened and embrittled by photooxidation over time. And the final thing to emphasize about light damage is that it is cumulative. So I imagine that every work of art has a personalized counter that adds up every single bit of exposure. So every day, every minute, the light levels are adding up in this imaginary counter. So when you look at an artwork that's 500 years old, it's had 500 years of this day was sunny, this day the curtain was closed, this day the photographers had their lights on for hours. And if you look at an artwork that is 5 years old today, you can imagine that in 500 years, it may be a unique, irreplaceable item that has had 500 years of exposure that's built up over time. And this is a fun comparison that I found when I was looking for images. The painting on the right is a famous one, but the one on the left, which is at the Museo del Prado, was also painted in Da Vinci's studio at the same time. So I don't know the exhibition history or the materials of the Museo del Prado version, but I do know that the Mona Lisa can never be taken off exhibit because the visitors to the Louvre expect to be able to see it. And we're definitely seeing some yellowing of the varnish and the oil medium from light exposure and some fading in the red tones. A lot of red colorants are light sensitive. So you often see oil painting portraits where the fading is not terribly evident, but the people are just a little less rosy than they should be. So I've just been telling you that light causes irreversible cumulative damage, but we can't just turn the lights off forever. We have to think about the mission of a repository and whether that mission can be fulfilled if the objects are never brought out. So I want to take some time to examine how light helps us to see objects and what factors go into it. Since all light is damaging to light-sensitive materials, excessive lighting causes damage with no justification, and underlighting causes damage with no benefit. So we're making a decision every day that some damage is acceptable to allow the use of an object, but we want to make that damage both minimized and also worthwhile to us. The most obvious way to adjust visibility is by the amount of light. The amount of light hitting an object is measured in lux or foot candles, and we'll circle back to this a few times over this talk. A foot candle is literally measured based on the amount of light hitting an object from a standard candle that is 1 foot away. 1 foot candle is roughly equal to 10 lux. And if you don't have access to something to measure light, you may not be able to specify the number of foot candles or lux in a room. But it's still helpful to think of the amount of light, even if you're just thinking of it in terms of more or less. And you want to see all of the colors possible, no matter what light level you achieve. Seeing all the colors that are available can be described by the Color Rendering Index, or CRI. You can see how the colors visible in the same apple diminish as the CRI goes down. Daylight is considered the gold standard of color rendering because it has an even distribution of all visible wavelengths. This is also known as full spectrum lighting, which is used to describe some of the best light bulbs. A CRI of 100 is perfect full spectrum lighting that, like you would get from daylight. Light bulbs generally come with CRI ratings, and we would consider 90 to 100 acceptable for exhibiting colored materials. But if you're working with mostly black and white documents, you may not need to prioritize color rendering to the same extent. Color temperature is related to color rendering. If you remember the blue and gold dress from a couple years ago, I read an explanation that said that your assumptions about the color are unconsciously based on what light source you thought it was photographed under. So people who spent more time under natural light assumed sunlight, and people who spent more time in artificial light assumed a yellower light. So if people know the light source, whether it's a warm yellow bulb or a cool blue light, their brains will adjust how they interpret colors they see. To show you how this can work, you see that the color in the apron and the color in the skirt are exactly the same. So there's no gradation in these bars that connect these two. But your eyes have no trouble seeing and adjusting to say which one is a black dress. And here, it's clearly a black dress that's been overexposed. But we can also look at the right image and say, yes, it's a yellow dress that's in a shadow, and it still looks yellow, even when we prove to ourselves that they're the same color. The daylight is a really blue light, and we're used to daylight being extremely bright. So if you have a blue colored light in a low light situation, it will feel underlit to the viewer versus having the same light level with a warm yellow light. This is a subjective experience for the viewer, but it can make a big difference in whether people complain about a space being too dark, as our brains will naturally adjust to interpret the situation based on many cues besides the objective light hitting our eyes. This mental visual adjustment will also occur with dark and light tones. So this is a phenomenon that occurs in both the eyes and the mind of the viewer. This image is a common illusion where the two gray squares are exactly the same darkness, but the darker surrounding makes the left one look lighter and the bright background darkens the other. This is very relevant in an exhibit situation where you might leave the bright outdoors and need a minute or two to adjust to view the indoor light levels. A well-designed exhibit will have areas of adjustment where the viewer's eyes will adjust naturally and it never feels like you're stepping into a dark room. Our eyes are incredibly flexible, but it takes longer than you might realize to adjust. So usually 60 to 90 seconds to adjust to lowered lighting without feeling like it's dark. And your vision will continue to improve and adjust for as much as 5 or 10 minutes. We also see visual adjustment within a single room, so the color of the walls can really change how bright a picture appears. Here's an example of using this technique in a gallery to make these works on paper seem brighter. These watercolors are both set on a darker wall, and they're lit more brightly than the wall, so that the art becomes the brightest thing in the room. Another major factor affecting visibility is how fine the detail is. So even though this miniature was painted with watercolors and it's very light sensitive, a certain level of light is needed to appreciate the details in it. If you think about performing very detailed work, the recommended light levels for sewing in a factory are 40 times the levels that are recommended for displaying watercolors. So this can cause a real tension between what's best for the object versus being able to fully experience it. A big painting like the Rothko, on the other hand, doesn't have that same level of tiny detail for the viewer to look at it. So it can be enjoyed at any light level. And finally, we need to consider the viewer. Everyone's vision will vary, and vision will decline as we get older. So if you look at the grandfather's face in this group, the kids are all looking at the screen happily, but he's creasing his brow because he can't make out the details. And seniors are just going to need more light to see the same level of detail. As a solution for exhibitions, some people suggest having special seniors days or tours a few days of the year where the collections are lit more brightly than normal without having the lights permanently brighter. And if you have older people working or researching or volunteering in your collection, this is important to take into consideration because light levels that are too low might mean that the objects are just exposed for longer, or they may be handled more just in order to see the information that they need. All the visibility factors that we're talking about were external factors that can apply to any object or any lighting situation. Let's take a closer look now at how light affects different types of objects. Whether we're talking about artworks or archival objects, similar components will behave similarly. The support for most items in an archival collection will be paper. And paper objects really differ from paintings in that the support will be visible, while a canvas painting would be covered with layers of paint and gesso. In general, supports of organic origin are more vulnerable than inorganic materials like metal and stone. And there is a reasonable correlation between a support's overall stability and its light resistance. So if you imagine old handmade rag paper versus a modern newsprint, the rag paper is more stable on a number of levels that include resistance to light exposure. Usually it's the medium we think of in terms of light sensitivity, and the media is the carrier of the information, so this is the thing that really needs to be preserved. Pigments and dyes are what create the color of any media, and to distinguish between a pigment and a dye, a pigment is a little particle of colored matter, while a dye is a chemical that is dissolved in something and it gets deposited or attached. So in general, most dyes are more sensitive than pigments. So colored textiles and liquid inks are going to be more prone to fading, but there can be a big range in both categories. A lake is just a dye that has been bound onto a colorless particle. So it acts like a pigment in that it's a particle, but it has the lower light sensitivity of a dye. And to talk about binder, I made that little diagram on the left. So the gray bar at the bottom is the support, whether that's paper or canvas or wood or whatever is holding your image up. The little blue shapes are pigment particles. So you see on the right where they're resting just on top of or slightly embedded in the support. This is typical of a manuscript or a drawing or a watercolor on paper. With a media like ink or watercolor, there's very little binder that surrounds the pigments, so they're unprotected and they're more vulnerable to light damage that involve other things in the environment, like humidity or oxygen. On the left, you see that the pigments are protected by the solid film and they're floating trapped inside that film like a layer of oil paint. This is protecting them from light-induced chemical reactions. So even if an oil painting and a watercolor are composed of the same pigments, the watercolor is going to be more sensitive. The painting could even have another layer on top. That thin gray layer on the left would represent if there's varnish on top of the painting, which is an additional filter to absorb UV and prevent the atmosphere from reacting with the pigments. And just to comment on some common media, graphite and charcoal derive their color from carbon, which is absolutely light fast. But inks often have a dye component included in them to adjust their color, even if they also have a light fast pigment present. Felt tip pens are almost exclusively dyes because they need to flow easily through the tip, and pigment particles are just much harder to keep flowing. And you'll see a lot of felt tip pens like a Sharpie get marketed as permanent. And when the manufacturer is using that word, what they really mean is waterproof, not lightproof. So black Sharpies actually fade very easily. They're not that kind of permanent. If you're looking for a light fast marker, you should be looking for ones that are marketed as pigment-based or light fast, not just with the word permanent attached. This is a demonstration of a classic way to test pigment light fastness by making a sample of the colors you're wondering about and then covering half of each sample so that part of it gets exposure and part doesn't. You can see that many of the watercolors did fairly well, but the last brown in the second row and the first brown in the third row have really changed in tone. This is probably a case where there's more than one pigment being used to make the brown. So the reddish one has faded while the grayish brown was more stable. I see most of these browns are really pretty stable. Red colors, on the other hand, can be a lot more sensitive. The ones that don't fade might be more expensive, or they might just not be the exact color that the artist wants. So there is a market for all these less permanent red colors, and many of them can be lost with light exposure. And this is what red fading can look like in a naturally aged object. You can see some of the original red color on the right, where the seams were protecting the fabric from the light. Like we were talking about, the blue and the red colors were exposed to the same amount of light, but only the red has faded. Blue wool standards are a standardized product where each color strip doubles in light resistance or the time to fade as you move across the strips. They can also be used as a standard to say that a certain object has the stability of blue wool 3, blue wool 1, which can then translate to a certain amount of acceptable exposure. They're also a way of demonstrating how much light exposure has occurred in your space. People use them like the media swatches where they would cover one. If you install them in an exhibit location, you can show how much fading was induced in a certain period. But there are some drawbacks to this. First, reading blue wool standards is sort of like closing the barn door after the horse is gone. If it's done while you have an exhibit hanging in that location, you can use them to say, yes, that was too much light, but it's already happened. My other concern with these strips is that they're designed for the textile industry And even the most sensitive blue strip is more stable than most paper objects. So the scale isn't really sensitive enough to be useful for an archival collection. I'll just really quickly touch on the environment. When I was talking about photooxidation, you recall the light is causing a chemical process that relies on oxygen and water in the reaction. This is why oil paint medium and varnish is protective. The most extreme way to prevent this has been done for a few extremely rare artifacts, like the Declaration of Independence. So it's displayed in a sealed case that's filled with an inert gas to prevent any further fading. And of course, this is not going to be common, but there are simple improvements to the environment that can really help reduce the effects of light on all your collection materials. Things like keeping the relative humidity lower and more consistent, using glazing to reduce air exposure when things are on display, and keeping collection boxes closed after use. And my final comment on sensitivity is that pristine objects might be considered more sensitive than previously exhibited ones. So here are two different copies of a 100-year-old poster. They're both printed in color originally, but the one on the left has lost all its color due to light exposure. The faded one is maybe still vulnerable to some weakening, but it's not going to fade anymore. This is an exaggerated example, but in general, some colors may be so sensitive, but by the time we get to form a light policy, they're already gone, and what's remaining is pretty stable. If we think about lighting policies and traditional lighting standards, these are some numbers that are recommended and commonly shared. You'll see these numbers used in designing exhibitions and in loan agreements. Based on studies of visitor experience, 50 lux is widely considered to be the lowest light that will allow proper perception of an exhibit. Enjoyment and perception will increase as the light increases up to 200 lux, but after that level, there's very little additional benefit. I'd add that in this day and age, there's really no reason for the UV to be over up to 75. I think between 5 and 10 is an easy to achieve goal, and we'll talk about UV more in a bit. And let's remember again that it's total exposure that matters as much as the current lux level. This is a chart that I made to break out some sort of to expand and distinguish categories within paper objects, because we tend to classify all paper items as sensitive, but there's a real difference in how quickly some things can be lost. These categories are not the same as the exposure categories we looked at before, because we're only inside the range of paper objects. So even the most stable paper object won't compare with metal or stone. You can see that very similar items can appear in more than one category. So a digital print can be very sensitive or fairly stable, depending on which ink is used. And of course, there are many more examples that didn't get into the chart. The items that I called extreme should really never be exhibited, and I would use caution even in letting researchers access these materials. Not that they can't ever be viewed, but having them exposed even for a day can cause significant damage. Items that are in the high or medium categories should be available to researchers, but display should be kept to traditional standards of no more than 50 lux and limited exhibition periods. The low sensitivity materials are a little more forgiving, but declaring that something is definitely low sensitivity really depends on identifying all of the components. An object is only as stable as its most sensitive part to it. Now, the recommendation for display of paper objects was 50 lux. But what does that really mean in terms of a viewer experience? You can see there's such a range of lighting situations where you could be in. And I think if you look at this and imagine it, you can get more of a picture to yourself of where this would be. Part of a building emergency exit lighting code is that maximum illumination cannot exceed 40 times minimum illumination. This is a direct reflection of what we discussed earlier, where people's eyes have trouble moving from bright to dark areas. And I think overall, the real takeaway I get from this is how flexible our lights can be, that we can function well in such a huge range of lighting environments. But people also have different expectations for these different environments and how well you would want to see. To think about what the UV levels you've seen mean, we measure UV in microwatts per lumen. So the little U with the tail is a symbol for micro, and it means 1/1,000,000th of a watt, which is a measure of energy. These UV levels are per lumen, so it's the amount of UV per a set amount of light. If you have a very bright incandescent bulb and a dimmer fluorescent bulb, then there might be more UV coming out of the incandescent bulb, even if the fluorescent bulb is making more UV per light. And then if they're giving out equal amounts of light, then there will be less UV in the incandescent bulb than the fluorescent tube. You'll also notice that daylight here has a very high UV rate, and we just saw that the light levels from daylight could be 100 or 1,000 times as bright as indoor lighting. So you multiply that 100 or 1,000 times brighter by this rate of UV as well, and there's just an enormous amount of UV in daylight. Because UV is more damaging than normal light, but it also doesn't add to the viewer's perception, filtering the UV from any daylight entry is an easy improvement. The LEDs, on the other hand, generally have a really low rate of UV production. This is not always guaranteed across the board because there are different types of LEDs on the market, but there are definitely really good choices available in the LED range. And they also have advantages in terms of energy efficiency and avoiding any heat buildup. Now, the traditional museum standard for UV is less than 75 microwatts per lumen. And this is based on the early work on lighting standards from the mid-20th century, when incandescent lights were the only real option for museum lighting. When people were coming up with museum standards, they sort of looked at the lights that they had, and when they decided that a certain amount of incandescent light was acceptable exposure, they said, well, if that is acceptable, then the UV level in that light must also be acceptable. And that's just what they were dealing with the technology of the time. But there's really no real reason to stick with this standard with the options that we have available today. Using LEDs can virtually eliminate UV at the source, but even light sources with more UV, like windows or older light bulbs, can be fitted with UV filters or films. And it may not disappear completely, absolutely, but it can easily be reduced down to 0 to 10 microwatts per lumen. Now, to check if you're complying with these standards, you would need to measure the light. This can be done with spot measurements, where a person is walking around with a light meter. CCHA and DIPSNY use an LSEC unit, which can measure light, UV, temperature, and relative heat. Or you can install monitors, where the device measures and records the light levels over time. Some monitors will transport that information remotely so that you can see all the readings while the monitor is in place. And for some, you need to collect them and download the data. I would use a light meter when an exhibit is being installed, and to adjust the lighting as it's getting set up, and then rely on the light monitors to look at the data over time. Both of these types of meters can be expensive, so if you're only using a light meter occasionally, this might be equipment that several nearby institutions could share. And there are definitely some other solutions. There's free and paid apps for smartphones that will measure your lux levels. If you search in the App Store for Light Meter, the best of these seem to test within about 10% off of a professional light meter, so that's pretty accurate. But I would recommend testing it out by making sure that you get different readings in different spots, and that if you measure the same spot twice, you're getting the same reading, so it's consistent and on different days. And you want to, the only thing to look for if you're picking an app is to make sure you get one that's giving you a result in either lux or foot candles, because many of these are made for photographers and they'll give you results in terms of aperture, ISO, and exposure time. If you are a photographer, you can also use the light meter inside of a camera on a blank white sheet. And if you take the camera light reading, you can convert it into lux with a little math. I did not put the calculations up here, but that's easy to find online as well. The UV beads in the top right corner are available on Amazon for less than $10, and they can be used to show whether UV is present or not. I'm not sure exactly how sensitive they are, but they can certainly help you to tell if windows or lights have UV filters installed in them. And you could also use them if you aren't sure if a frame has UV glazing in it. You can put the beads under to see if they stop changing colors, to see if the light's been filtered. The blue wool strips on the left are a very slow indicator that damage has already occurred, but they can be really useful to help demonstrate and show to other people when areas are getting too much light to change behavior in the future. And I suppose one of the interesting things about the blue wool indicators is they're really showing total exposure, not a light level. So it can help you to decide a more of a long-term plan for every day versus a single very bright event. We've been talking about measuring the light levels, but the point I want to make is that controlling light is really a question of controlling cumulative light exposure rather than just the light levels. Of course, they're connected, but we need to think about the long game and how much exposure is occurring over time, not just at any single point. Light exposure is controlled by two variables, the time and the light level. The light level, which we measure in lux, is multiplied by the time in hours, which gives us the unit of the lux hour. So some people might speak of a light budget based on so many thousand lux hours per year. I'm not going to get into a lux hour budget because I'm not expecting every institution to have accurate light meters, but even without knowing the exact numbers, you will know that reducing light levels or reducing time will reduce the overall exposure. And in addition to reducing the total light level, removing the UV will offer even more protection without affecting the viewer's experience. We should always keep in mind that light exposure is cumulative and irreversible, so any light damage will be permanent. If you've taken advantage of other DIPSNY educational materials, you're probably already familiar with the 10 agents of deterioration framework. When you follow this framework, each of the agents of deterioration have 5 steps to address them. To avoid light is usually the cheapest and the least technological action. The more time that objects spend in the dark, the less light damage they will get. However, this will come into a conflict with our responsibility to share the collection, so we need to balance stewardship with accessibility. I'd also like to highlight the last point here, to use facsimiles as appropriate. So deciding when the reproduction is acceptable is really a unique decision for any institution. But the facsimiles you can get have gotten better and better. And I also think that the public has become more understanding and accepting of them as well. I think that if a facsimile is presented honestly, as in this document is so important, but exhibiting it would endanger it, then when your viewer realizes you're using a facsimile, that can become an educational moment where the public learns about preservation and about how unique your collection is. When you're trying to block light exposure, windows are probably the easiest possible target to block light from entering. At a minimum, windows should be coated with a UV film. But there's more steps that could also reduce the incoming light as well as the UV. Because daylight is so much brighter than artificial lights, window lighting can cause bright spots that make it harder to look at collection items that are in the shadows. So windows can be really hard to manage. If you can't completely block a window, many systems can reduce the incoming light while still letting in some, so it gives you the feeling of daylight. And even if you are using the windows when you're open, they should have some option to block out the light completely when they're closed. Because if no one's present, that's completely wasted light. And I would like you to note that UV films can become exhausted, so I strongly recommend them, but you should plan to replace them after 10 years or so and use some sort of testing to make sure that they're still working before that point. Now, even if you've taken steps to reduce incoming light, you need to have a system to evaluate your successes or to pinpoint the areas that still need improvement. And this is a continuous process. One place where I can often detect light damage is where part of the image has been covered during exposure. So this watercolor landscape had a window mat over the top edge, and you can see the original blue sky where it was protected, but the blue is gone everywhere else. Other easy to spot signs of light damage are if a document has several signatures in different ink, and some seem much, much darker than others, or if colors appear dull when you would expect them to be bright, or if wood pulp paper is starting to look yellow. Detecting light damage can be tricky, and it is, again, you're detecting the damage after the fact. So definitely I would look at measuring UV and light as a more effective method of detection. Now, responding to anything that's spotted is a really key step. And this might be a place where the person who detects the problem needs to get more stakeholders involved in order to bring about change. But gathering the data only takes you so far, and it does need to eventually lead to action. And following these factors of deterioration, recover is the last and the least desirable step in responding to the agents of deterioration. But in the case of lighting damage, it really doesn't even apply. One of the questions that the conservation lab gets a lot is if we can bring back faded media. And the answer is no, we can't. Sometimes the one thing the digital imaging lab at CCHA can do is we can use UV light to detect faded ink so that we can create a facsimile where the original information is visible. This is not possible for every document. It really depends on the media and the support. But this is an example of the results we've gotten where the original looked like the top picture. And we've created a facsimile that looks like the bottom one. And of course, this is a facsimile, not a restoration of the original ink. So to review what we've talked about with exposure, I showed you this slide already, but this is really the synopsis of my entire talk. You understand that light exposure is a combination of the amount of light and the time of the exposure, and different objects will fade, darken, or oxidize at different rates. Now that we have this shared foundation, I'd like to spend some time talking about real-world examples of controlling light on collection objects. We'll be looking at all types of collections with both exhibition and storage concerns. The sculpture court is a common feature in museums. Architects love to make these beautiful light-filled spaces, and visitors love to experience them. It's a great use of natural daylight, and most stone and metal sculptures are completely impervious to light. It's more or less a perfect solution. A couple of possible pitfalls would be to include less stable sculpture, such as colored ceramics or painted or wooden sculpture. You also need to consider the visitor's transition into dimmer spaces after they've been in this very bright area, because it can make lower light areas seem very dim. Thinking about transitions to darker spaces, a lighthouse is not usually a place where you would display original artifacts, but it is a really useful place to think about visual adaptation. A typical lighthouse will be located in an extremely exposed area with no trees or shade. So on sunny days, there's not just the direct sun, but there's also reflected light from the water. So your eyes are very constricted and letting in very little light. When you step inside to climb the lighthouse, it will be very dark except for a few windows. So the visitors will not be able to read the text panels or look at artifacts or maybe even see the stairs to climb safely. This can be adapted by having visitors pause inside before they start to climb the lighthouse. So if there's any sort of entranceway to the lighthouse or a little room attached, this area will often be used as an entrance where visitors might pause to purchase tickets. And if you can extend that pause longer organically by having a docent give you a brief introduction to the lighthouse before the visitors start climbing, then you've given their eyes a chance to adapt, as well as delivering more educational content. On the other hand, if people just buy tickets and listen to the docent standing outside in the full sun, they're going to be blinded as soon as they start to climb. This picture is of a historic house where they couldn't apply UV film to the original historic glass, and they didn't want to install anything permanent to change the structure or the exterior appearance. So shutters and louvers were out of the question. They still wanted to use the window well for a display because their exhibit space was limited. So what they did was the window was screened with a translucent fluted plastic board, like you would use for a graphic sign. This reduces the light intensity by about 1/2, and it also adds to the insulating quality of the window. This is a simple method using a few push pins that are easily removed if the room use changes. And although the glare from that translucent panel is less than ideal, the background fabric that the objects are on is a darker matte shade. And the most important part is that the objects that were picked are all 0 or low sensitivity to go in this space. In particular, the brass stamps are very detailed, dark, low contrast objects. So seeing them well is really taking advantage of the strong window light. Unlike the historic house with its original window wells, a purpose-built display area, like this small art gallery, has full control of the lighting, and it can use a basic track pattern along each of the long walls. But the spot lamps have been really carefully adjusted to put the emphasis on the paintings, so the walls are much darker around that. Without knowing the artist's palettes, this gallery has to assume that there are some colors that are high sensitivity. Another potential source of light on collections is camera flashes. Flash photography is generally banned in museums, but I do not feel like it's a major preservation concern. It's true the light is very intense during the flash, but it's so brief that it doesn't really add up to a significant exposure. To give you some equivalents, a flash that's pointed at an object from a meter away will give an exposure that's equivalent to between 10 seconds to 2 minutes at 50 lux. So it's not nothing, but it's not that much. Another estimate I found for a room that was regularly used for weddings is that if 700 flashes were set off 5 meters from the objects, it would be like 1 hour on display at 50 lux. So most modern flashes already have the UV filtered out, but it would be reasonable to confirm that if a professional photographer was doing a shoot in your space. And there's plenty of other reasons to limit flash photography by the public because it can detract from your other visitors' experience. It could distract the photographer. Bringing in a lot of equipment can lead to accidents, but it's not a disaster if someone sneaks a flash photo against your policy, and it should not keep you up at night. So moving into storage situations, when artwork is not being looked at, any amount of light is unnecessary damage. So your storage should ideally be as dark as possible, but staff still needs to enter the storage spaces for many reasons, and there may even be workstations in some areas where collections are stored. Adequate task lighting will let them do their jobs and reduce the risk of accidents. If you have storage that's not kept in complete darkness, I would recommend covers that offer both light blocking and physical protection. If you have a number of framed items, then more sensitive ones like works on paper should get priority for covers, but it's not a bad idea for all your framed items if the lights are on regularly. And similarly, I'd like to see everything that is in storage put into an opaque housing. Alkaline housing has so many other advantages related to protection from dust, moisture, physical and chemical damage, but it also provides light protection. If your collection is visible to you, then it is available for light damage. In this example, there's textiles that have been stored correctly by rolling them around the outside of an alkaline tube, but then they're covered with an opaque paper so that they're protected from light and physical damage. The book on the right is being put into a 4-flap, which is recommended a lot to give it the physical support that it needs, but it will also block light from hitting it. And overall vigilance will help to detect other trouble spots, like if lids haven't been replaced on boxes, or if oversized papers are put uncovered on top of storage units. You know, even if you really have no other solution, a simple folder will protect it both physically and from light. I pulled this case study from a museum that has a robust system of light monitoring, and they controlled the light very carefully when they installed the exhibit. This is what the light log will look like if you're running a light monitor, and this is showing what's happening over the course of one day between 6 o'clock to about 8:30. When they looked at these light logs, they saw this enormous spike that was happening around 7 p.m. after the museum was closed. So that's happening when there's no visitors present. After some investigation, they realized that what was happening was as the sun went down, it was reflecting off of a glass building across the street. This only happened at certain times a year, and it did not happen during the day when they set up the exhibit and measured everything. So in that spike, the light exposure was going to 12 times when there were no visitors present, So not only were the pieces being overexposed, there wasn't even anyone there to look at them. In this case, covering the windows was not possible, and so the solution they devised was to cover the case every single night with a curtain on Velcro. This takes a real staff commitment, but it became part of their normal closing procedures, and the light logs after they started doing that showed that the peak had disappeared. I also think that the effort of covering the case every night will make the staff advocate more strongly for careful planning of their future displays. And this is my final and grandest case study. George Washington's tent, which he used as a field office during the Revolutionary War, is one of the most important artifacts at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. The tent needed extensive conservation and supports to be displayed, and the fabric cannot afford to be weakened anymore. So the museum needed to display this with the least light damage possible. When you go to see the tent, it's on display behind glass in a large theater. People are admitted once an hour, and first they watch a 20-minute film about the tent and its use during the war. So during this time, their eyes are adjusting to the dimmer light of the theater. After the film, the screen is lifted and then the tent is illuminated. So it's a very majestic presentation that makes people really appreciate the object. But it also means that the tent is only lit up to a very low light level for about 90 seconds per hour. And the visitors actually get a more meaningful experience of it than if they just wandered by and read the label text as well. This is a really lofty solution, but it's a great example of creative problem solving for a sensitive item that has to be on permanent display. And I'm going to open this up to questions now and get a quick drink. And I see in the chat, someone asked about buying the blue wool cards, and Marissa already put a supplier up for that. You can get blue wool cards from Gaylord.com. I know Talus also sells blue wool cards, but they're located in New York City, so they are not going to be available to ship. And I would also mention last time I looked, blue wool cards are around $20. So not much money at all. I have a question to go back to look at the sensitivity of collections. So I'm going to find that slide, and then maybe there's a specific question about something in here as well. If there's any other medias that someone would like me to throw in a category on the fly, I'd be happy to do that too. Meanwhile, I have a question about what brand or type of UV films would I recommend for windows in a historic house. I'm afraid I don't have any opinions on brands of UV films. I have not researched that. So if anyone has one that they've used, I'd love to hear from anyone else if you have a preferred brand. It's definitely a concern that if you have a historic house and you have older glass, you may not want to stick something directly on it. And so that's why there's also options like shutters or that sort of fluted plastic that I showed you. Or something I think would be preferable, but again, this depends on your institution, would be putting in a custom piece of a UV filtering plexiglass. And that's something that is going to give you the UV filtering. It doesn't adhere to your window, so you haven't changed the historic glass, but it also gives it that insulating layer and will help you with your heating in a historic house, which can be very drafty as well. And I see someone else has recommended Matico UV Guard, which has a 15-year guarantee and does not really cut down on the light entering. So that sounds good. And this is something, if I were buying it for myself, I would probably look at Amazon reviews. Um, Okay, I'm going to move us to the last slide where I'm putting up my contact information if there's any. Here we go. If there's anything you'd like to follow up on, you can also get in touch with me directly by email. The phone number there is for the Conservation Center. And so right now we're all working from home, and email is a better way to reach me, but I would love to talk more about anything here. I've had someone else has given a really useful comment that there was a poster presentation at AIC, that's the American Institute for Conservation conference, a year or so ago that broke down the various brands. AIC has all the posters get uploaded as PDFs, so you can look at them if you go to their website at culturalheritage.org, and you'll be able to find all of the posters from their conferences. I see someone's asked if DIPSNY offers UV meters to borrow or rent. Marissa's on the line and maybe she knows the answer to that. I know that if DIPSNY comes out to do an assessment of their collection, they will measure your light and your UV at that point, but I'm not sure if they have any circulating equipment. And Marissa will pop that in the chat if she can update me on that. Okay, so I have official word from DIPSNY that they do not have meters available to borrow or rent, but they do measure that when you get an assessment done. And it looks like we're sort of winding down on questions. I know that I talked for a long time, and so we're over an hour already. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I know I love talking about light, and so I'm glad that you guys were willing to listen to me.